Gift by Vladimir Nabokov. To Vera. Bored. The greater part of the gift, in Russian dar, was written in 1935 to 1937 in Berlin. Its last chapter was completed in 1937 on the French Riviera. The leading émigré magazine, Souvremnie Zapiski, conducted in Paris by a group of former members of the Social Revolutionary Party, published the novel serially, 63 to 67, 1937 to 1938. Omitting, however, Chapter 4, which was rejected for the same reasons that the biography it contains was rejected by Vasilev in Chapter 3, page 219. A pretty example of life finding itself obliged to imitate the very art it condemns. Only in 1952, almost 20 years after it was begun, did there appear an entire edition of the novel brought out by that Samaritan organization, the Chekhov Publishing House, New York. It is fascinating to imagine the regime under which Dar may be read in Russia. I have been living in Berlin since 1922, thus synchronously with the young man of the book, but neither this fact nor my sharing some of his interests, such as literature and Lepidoptera, should make one say, aha, and identify the designer with the design. I am not, and never was, Fyodor Godunov Shurintsev. My father is not the explorer of Central Asia that I may become someday. I never wooed Zina Mertz, and never worried about the poet Konchiev or any other writer. In fact, it is rather in Konchiev, as well as in any other incidental character, the novelist Vladimirov, that I distinguish odds and ends of myself as I was, circa 1925. In the days I worked on this book, I did not have the knack of recreating Berlin and its colony of expatriates as radically and ruthlessly as I have done in regard to the certain environments of my later English fiction. Here and there history shows through artistry. Fyodor's attitude toward Germany reflects too typically perhaps the crude and irrational contempt that Russian émigrés had for the natives in Berlin, Paris, or Prague. My young man is moreover influenced by the rise of a nauseous dictatorship belonging to the period when the novel was written and not to be the one it patchily reflects. The tremendous outflow of intellectuals that formed such a prominent part of the general exodus from Soviet Russia in the first years of the Bolshevist Revolution seems today like the wanderings of some mythical tribe whose bird signs and moon signs I now retrieve from the desert dust. We remained unknown to American intellectuals who, bewitched by communist propaganda, saw us merely as villainous generals, oil magnates, and gaunt ladies with long nets. That world is now gone. Gone are Bunin, Aldanov, Remizov. Gone is Vladislav Kodashevich, the greatest Russian poet of the 20th century has yet produced. The old intellectuals are now dying out and have not found successors in the so-called displaced persons of the last 2 decades who have carried abroad the provincialism and philistinism of their Soviet homeland, the world of the gift being at present as much of the phantasm as most of my other worlds. I can speak of this book with a certain degree of detachment. It is the last novel I wrote, or ever shall write, in Russian. Its heroine is not Zina, but Russian literature. The plot of Chapter 1 centers on Fyodor's poems. Chapter 2 is a search toward Pushkin and Fyodor's literary progress and contains his attempt to describe his father's zoological explorations. Chapter 3 shifts to Gogol, but its real hub is the love poem dedicated to Zina. Fyodor's book on Chernyshevsky, A Spiral Within a Sonnet, takes care of Chapter 4. The last chapter combines all the preceding themes and adumbrates the book Fyodor dreams of writing someday, The Gift. I wonder how far the imagination of the reader will follow the young lovers after they have been dismissed. The participation of so many Russian muses within the orchestration of the novel makes the transition especially hard. My son Dmitry Nabokov completed the first chapter in English, but was prevented from continuing by the exigencies of his career. The 4 other chapters were translated by Michael Skamo. In the winter of 1961 at Montreux, I carefully revised the translation of all 5 chapters. I am responsible for the versions of the various poems and bits of poems scattered throughout the book. The epigraph is not a fabrication. The apologic poem mimics an Onegin stanza. Vladimir Nabokov, Montreux, March 28, 1962. The Gift. An oak is a tree, a rose is a flower, a deer is an animal, a sparrow is a bird, Russia is our fatherland, death is inevitable. P. Smirnovsky, A Textbook of Russian Grammar, Chapter 1. One cloudy but luminous day towards 4 in the afternoon on April the 1st, 19... A foreign critic once remarked that while many novels, most German ones for example, begin with a date, it is only Russian authors who, in keeping with the honesty peculiar to our literature, omit the final digit. A moving van, very long and very yellow, hitched to a tractor that was also yellow with hypertrophied rear wheels and shamelessly exposed anatomy, pulled up in front of No. 7 Tannenberg Street in the west part of Berlin. The van's forehead bore a star-shaped ventilator. Running along its entire side was the name of a moving company in yard-high blue letters, each of which, including a square dot, was shaded laterally with black paint, a dishonest attempt to climb into the next dimension. On the sidewalk before the house in which I too shall dwell stood 2 people who would obviously come out to meet their furniture. In my suitcase there are more manuscripts than shirts. The man, arrayed in a rough greenish-brown overcoat, to which the wind imparted a ripple of life, that was tall, beetle-browned, and old, with the gray of his whiskers turning to russet in the area of the mouth in which he sensitively held a cold, half-deteriorated cigar, but the woman, thick-set and no longer young, with bow legs and a rather attractive Sado-Chinese face, wore an astrakhan jacket. The wind, having rounded her, brought a whiff of a rather good but slightly stale perfume. They both stood motionless and watched fixedly with such attentiveness that one might think they were about to be short-changed, as 3 red-necked, husky fellows in blue aprons wrestled with their furniture. Some day, he thought, I must use such a scene to start a good, thick, old-fashioned novel. The fleeting thought was touched with a careless irony. The irony, however, that was quite unnecessary, because somebody within him, on his behalf, independently from him, had absorbed all this, recorded it, and filed it away. He himself had only moved in today, and now, for the first time, in the still unaccustomed state of local resident, he had run out to buy a few things. He knew the street, and indeed the whole neighborhood. The boarding house from which he had moved was not far until now, however. The street had revolved and glided this way and that, without any connection with him. Today it had suddenly stopped. Henceforth it would settle down as an extension of his new domicile. Lined with the lindens of medium size was hanging droplets of rain, distributed among their intricate black twigs according to the future arrangement of leaves. Tomorrow each drop would contain a green pupil, complete with a smooth tarred surface some 30 feet across the variegated sidewalks. Hand-built and flattering to the feet, it rose at a barely perceptible angle, beginning with a post office and ending with a church, like an epistolary novel. With an practiced eye, he searched it for something that would become a daily sore spot, a daily torture for his senses, but there seemed to be nothing of that sort in the offing, and the diffused light of the gray spring day was not only above suspicion, but even promised to mollify any trifle that in more brilliant weather would not fail to crop up. This could be anything, the color of a building, for instance, that immediately provoked an unpleasant taste in the mouth, or smack of oatmeal, or even halva, an architectural detail that effusively caught one's attention every time one passed by, the irritating sham of a caryatid, a hanger-on and not a support, which even under lighter burden would crumple into plaster dust, or on a tree trunk, fastened to it by a rusty thumbtack, a pointless but perpetually preserved corner of a notice in longhand, runny ink, blue runaway dog, that had outlived its usefulness but had not been fully torn off, or else had object in a shop window, or a smell that refused at last moment to yield a memory and had seemed ready to shout and remained instead on its street corner, a mystery withdrawn into itself. No, there was nothing like that, not yet. In any case, it would be a good idea, he thought, some time at a leisure, to study the sequence of 3 or 4 kinds of shops, to see if he were right in conjecturing that such a sequence followed its own law of composition, so that, having found the most frequent arrangement, one could deduce the average cycle for the streets of a given city, for example, tobacco shop, pharmacy, greengrocery. On Tannenberg Street, these 3 were disassociated, occurring on different corners. Perhaps, however, the rhythmic swarming had not yet established itself, and in the future, yielding to that counterpoint, as the proprietors either went broke or moved, They would gradually begin to gather according to the proper pattern. The greengrocery, with a glance over its shoulder, would cross the street so as to be the first 7 and then 3 doors away for the pharmacy, in somewhat the same way as the jumbled letters in their places in a film commercial. And at the end there is always one that does a kind of flip and then hastily assumes its position, a comic character, the inevitable Jack the Sack among new recruits, and thus they will wait until an adjacent place becomes vacant, whereupon they will both wink across the tobacco shop as if to say, "Quick over here," and before you know it they are all in a row, forming a typical line. God, how I hate all this, the things in the shop windows, the obtuse face of the merchandise, and above all the ceremonial transaction, the exchange of cloying compliments before and after, and those lowered lashes of modest price, the nobility of the discount, the altruism of advertisements, all of this nasty imitation of good, which has a strange way of drawing in good people. Alexandra Yakovlevna, for example, confessed to me that when she goes shopping in familiar stores she is morally transplanted to a special world which she grows intoxicated from the wine of honesty, from the sweetness of mutual favors, and replies to the salesman's incarnadine smile with a smile of radiant rapture. The type of Berlin store that he entered was adequately to be determined by the presence in a corner of a small table holding a telephone, a directory, a narcissi in a vase, and a large ashtray. This shop did not carry the Russian-tipped cigarettes that he preferred, and he would have left empty-handed if it had not been for the tobacconist's speckled vest with mother-of-pearl buttons and his pumpkin-colored bald spot. Yes, all my life I shall be getting what extra little payment in kind to compensate my regular overpayment for merchandise foisted on me. As he crossed toward the pharmacy at the corner, he involuntarily turned his head because a burst of light had been ricocheted from his temple, and saw with that quick smile with which we greet a rainbow or a rose, a blindingly white parallelogram of sky being unloaded from the van, a dresser with mirror across which, as across a cinema screen, passed a flawlessly clear reflection of boughs, sliding and swaying not arboreally, but with the human vacillation produced by the nature of those who are carrying these boughs, this gliding facade. He walked on towards the shop, but what he had just seen, whether because it had given him a kindred pleasure, or because it had taken him unawares and jolted him as children in the hayloft fall into the resilient darkness, released in him that pleasant something which for several days now had been at the murky bottom of his every thought, taking possession of him at the slightest provocation. The collections of poems has been published, and when as now his mind tumbled like this, that is, when he recalled the 50-odd poems that had just come out, he would skim in an instant the entire book, so that in the instantaneous mist of this madly accelerated music one could not make any readable sense of the flicking lines. The familiar words would rush past, swirling amid violent foam, whose seething was transformed into a mighty flowing motion if one fixed one's eyes on it, as we used to do long ago, looking down at it from a vibrating mill bridge until the bridge turned into a ship's stern. Farewell! And this foam, and this flickering, and separate verse that rushed past all at once, all alone, shouting in wild ecstasy from afar, probably calling him home, all of this, together with the creamy white of the cover, was merged in a blissful feeling of exceptional purity. What am I doing? He thought, abruptly coming to his senses and realizing that the first thing he had done upon entering the next shop was to dump the change he had received at the tobacconist's onto the rubber eyelet, in the middle of the glass counter through which he glimpsed the submerged treasure of flask perfumes, while the salesgirl's gaze, condescending toward his odd behavior, followed with curiosity this absent-minded hand-paying for a purchase that had not yet been made. "A cake of almond soap, please," he said with dignity. Thereupon he returned with the same springy step to the house. The sidewalk before it was now empty save for those 3 blue chairs that looked as if they had been placed together by children. Within the van a small brown piano lay supine, tied up so that it could not rise, and with its 2 little metal soles shot up in the air. On the stairs he met the movers pounding down, knees turned out, and he was ringing the doorbell of his new abode. He heard voices and hammering upstairs. His landlady let him in and said that she had left his keys in his room. This large, predatory German woman had a funny name, Clara Stoboy, which to Russian's ears sounded like a sentimental firmness, as Clara is with thee, Stoboy. And here is the oblong room with the patiently waiting suitcase. and at this point his carefree mood changed to revulsion. God forbid that anyone know the awful, degrading boredom, the recurrent refusal to accept the vile yoke of recurrent new quarters, the impossibility of living face to face with totally strange objects, the inevitability of insomnia on that daybed. For some time he stood by the window. In the crimson way sky, opaline pits now and then formed where the blind sun circulated, and in response, on the gray convex roof of the van, the slender shadows of linden branches hastened headlong towards substantiation, but dissolved without having materialized. The house directly across the way was half enclosed in scaffolding, while the sound part of the brick facade was overgrown with window-invading ivy. At the far end of the path that cut through its front yard, he could make out the black sign of a coal cellar. Taken by itself, all this was a view, just as room itself was a separate entity, but now a middleman had appeared, and now that view became the view from this room and no other. The gift of sight which it now had received did not improve it. It would be hard, he mused, to transform the wallpaper, pale yellow with bluish tulips, into a distant steppe. The desert of the desk would have to be tilled for a long time before it could sprout its first rhymes, and much cigarette ash would have to fall under the armchair into its folds before it could become suitable for traveling. The landlady came to call him on the telephone, and he, politely stooping his shoulders, followed her into the dining room. In the first place, my dear sir, with Alexander Yakovlevich Chernyshevsky, why are they so reluctant at your boarding house to divulge your new number? Left there with a bang, did you? In the second place, I want to congratulate you. What, you haven't heard yet? Honestly? He hasn't even heard anything about it, said Alexander Yakovlevich, turning the other side of his voice towards something out of the range of the telephone. Well, in that case, get a firm grip on yourself and listen to this. I'm going to read it to you. The newly published collection of poems by the hitherto unknown author Fyodor Shurintsev strikes one as much as a brilliant phenomenon. The poetic talent of the author is so indisputable. You know what, I shan't go on, but you come over to our place tonight. Then you will get the whole article. No, Fyodor Konstantinovich, my good friend, I won't tell you anything now, neither who wrote this review, nor in what emigre Russian language paper it appeared. But if you want my personal opinion, then don't be offended. But I think the fellow is treating you much too kindly, so you'll come? Excellent. We'll be expecting you. As he hung up the receiver, Fyodor nearly knocked the stand with flexible steel rod, and attached the pencil on the table. He tried to catch it, and it was then that he did knock it off, and then he bumped his hip against the corner of the sideboard. Then he dropped a cigarette that he was pulling out of the pack as he walked, and finally he miscalculated the swing of the door, which flew open so resonantly that Frau Stoboy, just then passing along the corridor with a saucer of milk in her hand, uttered an icy "Oops!" He wanted to tell her that her pale yellow dress with bluish tulips was beautiful, that the parting in her frizzled hair and the quivering backs of her cheeks endowed her with a George Sandesque regality, that her dining room was the height of perfection, but he limited himself to a beaming smile and nearly tripped over the tiger stripes, which had not kept up with the cat as it jumped aside. After all, though, he had never doubted that it would be this way, that in the world, in the person of a few hundred lovers of literature who had left St. Petersburg, Moscow, and Kiev, would immediately appreciate his gift. We have before us a thin volume entitled Poems, a plain swallowtail library, which in recent years has become just as much de rigueur as the braiding of not long ago, from lunar reveries to symbolic Latin, containing about 50 12-line poems, all devoted to a single theme, childhood. In fervently composing them, the author sought, on the one hand, to generalize reminiscences by the selecting elements typical of any successful childhood, hence their seeming obviousness, and on the other hand, he has allowed only his genuine quiddity to penetrate into his poems, hence their seeming fastidiousness. At the same time, he had to take great pains not to lose either his control of the game or the viewpoint of the plaything, the strategy of inspiration and the tactics of the mind, the flash of poetry and the spectre of translucent prose. These are the epithets that seem to us to characterize with sufficient accuracy the art of this young poet. And having locked his door, He took out his book and threw himself on the couch. He had to reread it right away before the excitement had time to cool, in order to check the superior quality of the poems and forefancy all the details of the high approbation given them by the intelligent, delightful, as yet unnamed reviewer. And now, as he sampled and tested them, he was doing the exact opposite of what he had done a short time ago when he had skimmed over the book in one instantaneous thought. Now he read in 3 dimensions, as it were, carefully exploring each poem, lifted out like a cube from among the rest and bathed from all sides in that wonderful fluffy country air, after which one is always so tired in the evening. In other words, as he read, he again made use of all the materials already once gathered by his memory in the extraction of the present poems, and reconstructed everything, absolutely everything. As a returning traveler sees in an orphan's eyes not only the smile of his mother, whom he had known in his youth, but also an avenue ending in a burst of yellow light, and that auburn leaf on the bench, and everything, everything. The collection opened with the poem The Lost Bell, and one felt it was beginning to rain. One of those evenings, heavy with clouds that go so well with northern firs, had condensed around the house. The avenue had returned for the park for the round night, and its entrance was shrouded in dusk. Now the unfolding white shutters separate from the rooms from the exterior darkness, whither the brighter portions of the various household objects have already crossed to take up the tentative positions on different levels of the hopelessly back garden. Bedtime is now at hand. Games grow half-hearted and somewhat callous. She is old, and she groans painfully as she kneels in 3 laborious stages. My ball has rolled under the nurse's commode. On the floor a candle tugs at the ends of the shadows, this way and that, but the ball is gone. Then comes the crooked poker. It putters and clatters in vain, knocks out a button, and then half a zwieback. Suddenly out darts the ball into the quivering darkness, crosses the whole room, and promptly goes under the impregnable sofa. Why doesn't the appetite quivering quite satisfy me? Or does the puppeteer's colossal hand appear here for an instant among the creatures whose size in the eye had come to accept, so that the spectator's first reaction at the end of the show is, "How big I have grown!" After all, the room really was quivering, and that flickering, carousel-like movement of the shadows across the wall when the light is being carried away, or the shadowy camel on the ceiling with its monstrous humps heaving when the nurse wrestles with the bulky and unstable reed screen, whose expansion is inversely proportional to its degree of equilibrium. These are my very earliest memories, the ones closest to the original source. My probing thought often turns toward that original source, toward that reverse nothingness. Thus the nebulous state of the infant always seems to me to be a slow convalescence after a dreadful illness, and the receding from primal non-existence becomes an approach to it, when I strain my memory to the very limit so as to taste that darkness and use its lessons to prepare myself for the darkness to come. But as I turn my life upside down so that birth becomes death, I fail to see at the verge of this dying in reverse anything that would correspond to the boundless terror that even a centenarian is said to experience when he faces the positive end. Nothing except perhaps the aforementioned shadows which, rising from somewhere below when the candle takes off to leave the room, while the shadow of the left brass knob at the foot of my bed sweeps out past like a black head, swelling at its moves, assume their accustomed places above my nursery cot, and in their corners grow brazen, bearing only casual likeness to their natural models. In a whole set of poems, disarming by their sincerity. No, that's nonsense. Why must one disarm the reader? Is he dangerous? In a whole set of excellent, or to put it even more strongly, remarkable poems, the author sings not only of these frightening shadows, but of brighter moments as well. Nonsense, I say. He does not write like that, my nameless unknown eulogist, and it was only for his sake that I poetized the memory of these 2 precious and I think ancient toys. The first was an ample painted flower pot containing an artificial plant from a sunny land, on which was perched a stuffed tropical songbird so astonishingly lifelike that it seemed about to take wing, with black plumage and an amethyst breast, and with the big key had been wheedled from the housekeeper Ivanovna, inserted in the side of the pot, and given several tight, vivifying turns, the little Malayan nightingale would open its beak. No, it would not even open its beak, for something odd had happened to the clockwork mechanism, to some spring or other, which, however, stored up its action for later. The bird would not sing then, but if not, one forgot about it. and a week later happened to walk past its lofty wardrobe-top perch, then some mysterious tremor would suddenly make it emit its magical warbling, and how marvelously, how long it would trill, puffing out its ruffled little breast, it would finish, and then on your way out you would tread on another floorboard, and in special response it would utter final whistle, and grow silent halfway through the note. The other of the poetized toys, which was in another room, also on a high shelf, behaved in similar fashion, but with a zany suggestion of imitation, as the spirit of parody always goes along with genuine poetry. This was a clown in satin plus-bores who was propping himself on two whitewashed parallel bars, and who would be set in motion by an accidental jolt, to the sound of miniature music, with a comical pronunciation, tinkling somewhere beneath his little platform as he lifted his legs in white stockings and with pom-poms on the shoes, higher and higher at barely perceptible jerks, and abruptly everything stopped, and he froze in an angular attitude. And perhaps it is the same with my poems, but the truthfulness of juxtapositions and deductions is sometimes better preserved on the near side of the verbal fence. From the accumulating poetical pieces in the book we gradually obtain the image of an extremely receptive boy living in the extremely favorable surroundings. Our poet was born on July 12, 1900, in the Lishino manor, which for generations had been the country estate for the Gounod Chernyshev. Again, even before he reached school age, the boy read through a considerable number of books from his father's library, and his interesting reminiscences so-and-so recalls how enthusiastically little Fedya and his sister Tanya, who was 2 years his elder, engaged in amateur theatricals, and how they would even write plays themselves for their performances. That, my good man, may be the true of other poets, but in my case it is a lie. I have always been indifferent to the theater, although I remember that we did have a puppet theater with cardboard trees, and a crenellated castle with celluloid windows in the color of raspberry jelly, through which the painted flames, like those on Vereshchagin's picture of the Moscow fire, flickered when a candle was lighted inside, and it was this candle which, not without our participation, eventually caused the conflagration of the entire building. Oh, but Tanya and I were fastidious when it came to toys. From indifferent givers on the outside we would often receive quite wretched things. Anything that came in a flat carton with illustrated cover boded ill. To one such cover I tried to devote my stipulated 12 lines, but somehow the poem did not rise. A family seated around a circular table illuminated by a lamp. The boy dressed in an impossible sailor suit with a red tie. The girl wears laced boots, also red, both with expressions of sensuous delectation, are stringing beads of various colors on straw-like rods, making little baskets, bird cages, and boxes, and with similar enthusiasm the half-witted parents take part in the same pastime, the father with a prize growth on his pleased face, the mother with her imposing bosom. The dog is also looking under the table, and envious grandma can be seen ensconced in the background. These same children have now grown up, and I have often run across them in advertisements. He, with his glossy, sleekly tanned cheeks, is puffing voluptuously on a cigarette or holding in his brawny hand with a carnivorous grin a sandwich containing something red, eat more meat. She is smiling at a stocking she herself is wearing, or with depraved delight, pouring artificial cream on a canned fruit. And in time they will become sprightly, rosy, gormandizing oldsters, and still have ahead of them the infernal black beauty of oaken caskets and a palm-decked display window. Thus a world of handsome demons develops side by side with us in a cheerfully sinister relationship to our everyday existence. But in the handsome demon there is always some secret flaw, a shameful wart on the behind of this semblance of perfection. The glamorous glutton of the advertisement, gorging himself on gelatin, can never know the quiet joys of the gourmet, and his fashions, lingering on the billboard while we move onward, are always just a little behind on those of real life. Some day I shall come back to a discussion of this nemesis, which finds a soft spot in it for its blow exactly where the whole sense and power of the creature it strikes seems to lie. In general, Tanya and I preferred sweaty games to quiet ones, running, hide-and-seek, battles. How remarkably the word battle, strategy, suggests the sound of springy compression when one rammed into the toy gun, its projectile, a 6-inch stick of colored wood, deprived of its rubber suction cup in order to increase by impact, with which it struck the gilt tin of a breastplate, worn by a cross between a cuirassier and a redskin, making in it a respectable little dent. You reload the bottom of the barrel, with the creaking of the springs resiliently pressing it down on the floor, and you see, half concealed by the door, that your double is stopped in the mirror, rainbow feathers and headband standing on it. The author had occasion to hide. We are now in the Guranov Sherdintsev's mansion on the English quay of the Neva, where it stands even today among draperies under tables, behind the upright cushions of silk divans, in a wardrobe where moth crystals crunched under one's feet, and whence one could observe unseen a slowly passing manservant who would seem strangely different, alive, ethereal, smelling of apples and tea, and also under a helical staircase, or behind a lonely buffet, forgotten in a bare room, on whose dusty shelves vegetated such objects as a necklace made of a wolf's teeth, a small bare-bellied idol of almalite, another of porcelain, its black tongue stuck out in national greeting, a chest set with camels instead of bishops, an articulated wooden dragon, a soiled snuff-box of clouded glass, ditto of a gate, a shaman's tambourine, and the rabbit's foot going with it, a boot of wapty leather with an inner sole made from the bark of a blue honeysuckle, an Innis-formed Tibetian coin, a cup of Kara-jade, a silver brooch with turquoises, a lama's lapad, and lots of similar junk which, like dust, like the postcard from a German spa with its mother-of-pearl Gruss, my father, who could not stomach ethnography, somehow happened to bring back from his fabulous travels. The real treasures, his butterfly collection, his museum, were preserved in 3 locked halls, but the present book of poems contains nothing about that, a special intuition forwarded by the young author that some day he would want to speak in another way, not in miniature verse, both charms and chimes, but in a very different, manly words about his famous father. Again something had gone wrong, and one hears the flippantly flat little voice of the receiver, perhaps even of the female sex. With warm affection the poet recalls the rooms of the family house where his childhood, was spent. He has been able to imbue with much lyricism the poetic descriptions of objects among which it was spent. When you listen closely, we all attentively and piously, the strains of the past. Thus, for instance, he depicts lampshades, lithographs on the walls, his schoolroom desk, the weekly visits of the floor polishers, who leave behind an odor compounded of frost, sweat, and mastic, and the checking of the checks. On Thursday there comes from the clock shop a courteous old man who proceeds to wind with a leisurely hand all the clocks in the house. He steals at his own watch a glance, and sets the clock on the wall. He stands on a chair and he waits for the clock to discharge its noon completely. Then, having done well his agreeable task, he soundlessly puts back the chair, and with a slight whir the clock ticks, giving an occasional tongue clack with its pendulum, and making a strange pause as if to gather its strength before striking. Its ticking, like an unrolled tape divided by stripes into inches, served as an endless measure of my insomnias. It was just as hard for me to fall asleep as to sneeze without having tickled with something the inside of a nostril, or to commit suicide by resorting to means of the body's disposal, swallowing my tongue, or something like that. At the beginning of the agonizing night, I could still play for time by subsisting on conversations with Tanya, whose bed stood in the next room. Despite rules, we would open the door slightly, and then when we heard our governess going into her own room, which was adjacent to Tanya's, one of us would gently shut it, a lightning barefoot sprint, and then a dive into bed. While the door was ajar, we'd exchange conundrums from room to room, every now and then lapsing into silence. I can still hear the tone of this twin silence in the dark, she to guess mine, and I to think of another. Mine were always on the fantastic and silly side, while Tanya adhered to classical models. Mon premier est un métal précieux. Mon second est un habitant de queue. And mon tout est un fruit délicieux. Sometimes she would fall asleep while I waited patiently, thinking that she was struggling with my riddle, and neither my pleading nor my imprecations would succeed in reviving her. After this I would voyage for more than an hour through the dark of my bed, arching the bedclothes over myself so as to form a cavern, at whose distant exit I glimpsed a bit of oblique bluish light that had nothing in common with my bedroom, with the Neva night, with the rich, darkly translucent flounces of the window curtains. The cave I was exploring held in its folds and fissures such a dreamy reality, brimmed with such oppressive mystery, that a throbbing as of a muted drum would begin in my chest and in my ears, in its depths, where the father had discovered a new species of bat, I could make out the high cheekbones of an idol hewn from the rock, and when I finally dozed off, a dozen strong hands would overturn me, and with an awful silk-ripping sound, someone would unstitch me from top to bottom, after which an agile hand would slip inside me and powerfully squeeze my heart. Or else I would be turned into a horse, screaming in a Mongolian voice. Shamans yanked at its hocks with lassos so that its legs would break with a crunch and collapse at right angles to the body, my body, which lay with its chest pressed against the yellow ground, and as a sign of extreme agony the horse's tail would rise fountain-like and draw it back, and I awoke. Time to get up. The stove heater pats the glistening facings of the stove to determine if the fire has grown to the top. It has. And to its hot hum the morning responds with the silence of snow, pink shaded azure and immaculate whiteness. It's strange how a memory will grow into a wax figure, how the cherub grows suspiciously prettier as a frame darkens with age. Strange are the mishaps of memory. I emigrated 7 years ago. This foreign land has by now lost its aura of abroadness, just as my own ceased to be a geographic habit. The year 7, the wandering ghost of an empire, immediately adopted this system of reckoning, akin to the one formerly introduced by the ardent French citizen in honor of newborn liberty. But the years roll on, and honor is no consolation. Recollections either melt away or else acquire a deathly gloss, so that instead of marvelous apparitions we are left with a fan of picture postcards.